Hello, this is Radio Liberty, current time channel. This is Archaeology, special interview. I'm Sergey Medvedev. Today our special guest is academician, historian Yuri Pivovarov. Yuri, hello. Hello, Sergey. We meet quite regularly at different TV channels. It was Culture Channel, it was TV Rain Channel. Many times we saw each other in the current time on Radio Liberty. And this time it's for the first time since the beginning of the war that started on 24th of February in 2022. I would like to learn your opinion through the lens of the long Russian history. And from this point of view, was this war inevitable? Is it a part of this long line of Russian history? There is nothing unavoidable in history. There are certain logical events, actions, but this war was not unavoidable. This war could be avoided and shouldn't be started. Moreover, this war is even more random than it is logical. So what is randomness of this war? Because it was born in the imagination of one person. So I think it was born in the imagination of one person and some people around him. But we shouldn't forget that this person has been in power for 23 years in Russia, and the Russian people support him, and even such an unnatural desire of his to prolong his presidential term, to reset to zero the number of his presidential terms. This desire of his was supported by the Russian people, and no matter what they say in terms of the results of elections that they're manufactured, but the fact is fact. Many people, the overwhelming majority, supports Putin from election to election, including such an outrageous act as a reset to zero the number of presidential terms. It's just nonsense, and nobody can believe that. So if we didn't have this reset to zero, we wouldn't have this war. Don't you think there is a certain logic in everything that happened? Let me rephrase the question. The war was probably inevitable, but probably it was objective. Yes, I would agree with you. Besides, we shouldn't forget that the war started in 2014. Now it's just in a different phase, kind of grandiose phase. In some way, it's kind of a bizarre phase of the war. They formed a new regime by 2020. They practically abolished the Russian constitution. Good or bad, but it used to work. It's not anymore. And they had this anti-state coup. The state was completely destroyed, and they imposed a neo-totalitarian dictatorship, and such dictatorships can't live in peace. They wage a civil war against their own people, and they wage imperialistic war against neighboring countries, and let alone if they are fraternal countries. They hate them. Yes, you're right. I would like to refer to your old paper that's called Russian System, published in 2001. You did it together with your co-author. I think you disagreed since then with Andrei Fursov. Could you say that everything that you wrote is confirmed today? I mean, the theory of Russian system. I reread your paper, and literally everything goes along with the paper. It's a power-centered state and superfluous people like you and me who are kicked out from the country, just as you wrote it. And Putin is kind of following the script, the scenario of Russian history. See, the work was written in 1995. Maybe it was published in 2001. Oh yes, it was published in a Polish publication. But this work was not completed because we as authors, we disagreed on certain things. One of us went to communists, and myself, I'm here talking to you. I don't think that that concept means a lot. It was just an attempt to look at certain events of Russian history in different way, and we were trying to find back then certain definitions and terms. for this new concept of Russian history. Let me rephrase it. Outside of this work, do you think that a 500-year-old logic of Russian history reproduced today, cycles of modernization and counter-modernization, expansion and contraction of the empire, and Putin is just following this cyclical concept that is supported with the oil prices? Actually, I don't believe in this concept of cycles. Why these cycles? Modernization, counter-reforms. I think the whole thing is much more complicated. And I don't think that Putin can be a part of the Russian history logic. Putin is an outcome of the communist regime. This is the outcome of the USSR and all those unaddressed issues of Stalinism, Leninism, and all other things. And also that we didn't complete this anti-Bolsheviks, anti-Stalin, and anti-Lenin work. And all this contributed to the rise of neo-totalitarianism, as I called it, totalitarianism too. Our train left the totalitarianism station, but it didn't arrive to democracy station. Somehow we got to neo-totalitarianism station. When do you think we actually missed the crossroad? In 1991, we needed to have disclosure of personal files of KGB and Communist Party. Let me tell you this. Not long before his death, Yuri Afanasyev spoke at my department at the university, and this is what he said. Yes, it was a legendary name. He said there are three people who are guilty of what's going on. It was long ago, he died long ago, but the trend was clear where Putin regime is leading us to. He said there are three people who are guilty of what's going on. It's Yeltsin, Sobchak, mayor of St. Petersburg back then, and he, Afanasyev. And I asked him why he is guilty, and he said, we didn't know what to do, but we got down to it anyway. And I was surprised with his fearlessness and self-chastising. I just realized that how painful it is for him, what a tragedy it is for him, because what turned out to be wasn't what they dreamed of right before perestroika happened. But nobody knew how to put the economy on a different track and what to do with politics. But talking about the disclosure of personal files of KGB and Communist Party, Afanasyev was a member of Communist Party, Yeltsin was a member of Communist Party, but the perestroika was headed by the Secretary General of the Communist Party. The situation just turned out to be different. Therefore, I think they made some serious mistakes and they probably missed many things. And they were so happy about what's going on, about all these changes, and we're enjoying all these changes. And not only oligarchs, but myself, we all felt that this horrible yoke of the Soviet Union was over, but people kind of, remember the stability of that time. But the situation was absolutely outrageous, and I remember it very well, and I experienced this myself, and my family experienced that. It wasn't great, it wasn't stability during the Soviet time, and of course we are guilty. We're, like Germans are guilty of Hitler being in power, like Russians are guilty of Bolsheviks being in power and not a democratic so-called White Guard movement. But see, every time when history or nation or any civilization makes this choice, we understand that the crossroads are different. There was a crossroad in 1905 and 1907, in 1917 in February. We passed another crossroad. In 1991 there was another crossroad in the country, but every time history was just kind of making these turns on these crossroads, and for some reason it brought us to Putin and the war. We'll talk about Germany in the second part of our stream, but I would like to understand the role and the place of Putin in this war, in this system. In terms of Russian history, I think his role finally will be evaluated as absolutely negative, as betrayal. He betrayed his people, he betrayed people of other countries, and I think that the history will sentence him, and I don't know what kind of sentence it will be. Will it catch him like it was in Nuremberg, and many leaders of the Third Reich were hanged. I don't know, but maybe there will be a symbolical punishment, not only in the minds of Russian people, but in the minds of the whole humanity, and he will remain in the history like a villain who was killing and torturing people for no reason, and who destroyed another attempt of his motherland to become a decent country. I'm not talking about a great country, but at least decent country. The crossroads were passed differently. In 1905, 1907, we passed it quite successfully. We came out from the first revolution pretty well. We had parliamentary monarchy. There was no absolute monarchy anymore. There were political parties. There was no censorship. There was a rise of science and economy. Russia was becoming an open country. There were great prospects, and many experts wrote about it, both in Russia and in the West. Then Russia broke down in 1917. These breakdowns of 1917 and now the breakdown during Putin time, it seems like Russia is intentionally chiseled out from the world of globalization, modernization, but the Soviet modernization, and there was this cruel modernization of Stalin. These nation-suicide acts, are they protests against the imposed order, acts of voluntarism? Just let me tell you one thing. There was no Stalin's modernization. The modernization is impossible and slaves are building tank factories or something else. It's not a modernization. It's something else. It's the time of great terror. It's time of great acts of national suicides that Stalin was manufacturing, and those mass famines and friendships with other animals like Hitler. Why it happens in Russia? Well, first of all, in many countries there are failures, and not always things settle down right away. Look at French history, when after the French Revolution, as we studied in school, with bourgeois revolution, so there were other revolutions in 1830, in 1848, and the events of 1870s, the Paris Commune. So things were not simple, and the events of 1958, when France barely held on and managed to pass the constitution of the Fifth Republic, that actually finished this time of this endless turbulence, the time of revolutions, mutinies, etc. But in Russia, it kind of went much deeper. When we touch on Germany in the second part of our interview, I have to tell you this, that German National Socialist Revolution of 1933, it lasted only 12 years, much shorter than in Russia, and it did not touch the society so deeply. It did not destroy the German society as Leninist Revolution destroyed young society of Russia. It was just rising. We'll continue our talk about Germany after a small break. This is Archaeology Special Interview. Our special guest, academician Yuri Pivovarov. Yuri, in the second part, let's talk about Germany. I'll ask you the same question. Was fascism an objective phenomenon in Germany? Was Hitler's coming, if not programmed, but predetermined by the logic of German history, from German Romanticism to defeat in World War I, and then ressentiment and appearance of German revanchism? Probably it was predetermined, but I'm always cautious when we talk about Germany, Russia, or any other country. We shouldn't look for root causes of today's atrocities somewhere deep in the history. When in 1809 Fichte wrote his work, The Close Commercial State, I think that he already formulated some principles of future German nationalism, this aggressive nationalism. But frankly, I wouldn't make Fichte responsible for what was going on in Germany in the 1930s. The same I wouldn't do to Russian philosophers of 19th century, making them responsible for what happened in Russia later. As famous Russian poet Lermontov said, and he was an officer, paraphrasing his words, yet it still played a significant role. It wasn't fascism or national socialism. It didn't happen out of the blue, or because there was such a scumbag like Hitler or Goebbels, they were so talented. Certainly there was something going on in the society, and a classic of German literature, Thomas Mann, wrote about it, and the defeat of Germany in World War I, and the Weimar Republic of 1918, and the treaty in Versailles in 1919. Germany was on its knees, Germany was insulted. Then there was the Great Depression that hit the weakest links of the chain of imperialism, as Lenin used to call it. And then there was this fraternal support of Russian international communists for national German communists. Grigory Zinoviev, who used to be the head of international communists in Russia, he called social democrats, who were real representatives of the working class. They did everything to make the 20th century less horrible, and they're probably one of the best representatives of the 20th century, and they managed to achieve great things for the working class and for the social and political culture. Zinoviev called them social fascists, and they should be fought against. And the communists in Germany, who were promoters of Moscow Comintern policy, they should join forces with National Socialists, because National Socialists, they hated Western bourgeois democracy, just like the dwellers of the Kremlin. They provided moral and political support. So the regimes were cooperating not only as a result of Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but before that too. Can we make parallels between German history and Russian history? I mean, Stalin's Russia and Putin's Russia. Say, these are the countries of delayed modernization if we compare them with Western Europe. I mean, the Atlantic part of it, so-called Anglo-Saxon Europe. In these countries, they build this corporate capitalism, and then it turns into fascism, let it be Hitler's fascism or Stalin's Bolshevik or Putin's fascism. This is what they have in common, and this is the main thing. This is when a person is tortured or killed, and whether they are in the basement of Gestapo or KGB, it doesn't matter. They are horrified and tormented. But talking about social things, there are lots of differences. And I wouldn't say that delayed modernization is the key. I would say it's far-fetched. They say that German democracy was not mature comparing with Anglo-Saxon democracy. But I'm actually quite surprised how stable German democracy was. In 1870s, after the empire was actually formed as a result of Franco-Prussian War, in Reichstag, this is the parliament of Germany, what is called Bundestag today. They had the same political arrangement that they have today. They had Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, Liberals, and Social Democrats. They were dominating. They cooperated with Christian Democrats and Liberals. The same was during the Weimar Republic in the 1920s. And despite all those revolutions and wars, the German party system surprisingly managed to sail through all of that, and it was actually formed much earlier than French system. Talking about English political system, that the Whigs and Tories existed at the end of the 17th century, and the parliament already worked. It was located in London, worked 20 weeks a year. They had to pass 19 laws every year. It's a different story. However, the ideals of British democracy were implemented on the other side of the pond. It was a mass democracy. It wasn't the democracy only for lords and for rich people. It was democracy for everybody. And they went through a horrible revolution in America. I mean, it was quite tough and harsh. And the fight for independence was quite a serious thing. It was 1787-88. In Russia, when we talk about revolution, do you think that there was a revolution in Russia in 2022? No, I don't think so. I think that the last revolution in Russia happened anti-communist and anti-Soviet revolution at the end of 1980s, the beginning of 1990s. But this incredible transformation of the regime and the society that we see today in Russia, actually it has been happening before that. Just imagine that they say that there is a state-forming people in the country. We're not going to be talking about this because it's going to take long, but anyway, it's destruction of the multinational country. This is a way to destroy the country. It's like the same as Bolsheviks' constitution of 1922. It was passed in 1922 by the leadership of the Communist Party, and in 1924 it was enacted. And it was said in that constitution that in the Soviet Union can be joined by any country that where they have socialist order, wherever it is, in Africa or Latin America. And on the other hand, they were giving them the right of secession to leave this union. Lenin actually included this in the constitution, and Stalin was resisting that. And Lenin thought it's fine if they have this right, because the whole world will be communist, because where this country could go, where communism is everywhere. Putin's regime is not a revolution. It is, if you want, it's different. When you keep saying modernization or democracy, these words have different connotations. But I think what we see today in Putin's regime, this is a multi-year counter-modernization. This is a latent many years falling into abyss. And I'm not sure that Russia will be able to crawl out of this situation. When many of my friends are saying it would be great if Russia was split into different countries and republics, well, it's extremely dangerous because Russia has nuclear weapons. When we are comparing Putinism and National Socialism, it's possible and it can be done, and actually I do that myself and I write about it. But we shouldn't forget that Hitler didn't have nuclear weapons. And Putin does. The first war, the Korean War of 1950s, and when countries were threatening each other with nuclear weapons, and MacArthur was asking President Truman to give him the right to throw a nuclear bomb at Russians or Chinese, but Truman didn't allow him, and he replaced MacArthur. So that's the difference. Yes, I agree with you. But in general, would you agree that in the modern Russia, with certain prefixes, we can say that this is fascism? So I don't use a term fascism because it's an Italian term, because fascism in Russian political language, it's something bad, everything bad. Besides, it's well known that communists, they avoided National Socialism term, because socialism, how it can be National Socialism, this National Socialist Party, how it works, a workers' party, but actually they were murderers. It was a huge party, actually, 80 million people, population, and 8 million members, and 4 million more in such organizations, and Hitler Jugend and others. I wouldn't say that today's regime in Russia is fascist regime. It's not National Socialist regime, and it's not a racist regime yet. But I think if its regime sustains and somehow it will live more and evolve, I think it'll get to the point when it will be a racist or anti-Semite concept. People say that Putin is not an anti-Semite, but because he has Jewish friends, but it doesn't matter. Anti-Semitism, it was quite a school that is quite typical for Germans and many other peoples. So what's going to happen then? What to do for Tatar and Bashkir people when that happens? I think that the place of Jews is taken by the Ukrainians. So what do they do in Russia? They kind of reject others, and we can see these practices of genocide. This is what they do in the territories of Ukraine. So there is lots of parallels, like Lebensborn, how they take children away, and how the Ostarbeiters, how they take people away, and they have this filter filtration camps. Maybe it's better to use here a Nazism term or a National Bolshevism. Well, National Bolshevism already passed, so there is no Bolshevism in Putin's regime in the classical sense of the word. If we consider Bolshevism as something determined, it's not just a name for evil. So if we name it as evil, then it's fine. Yes, of course, this is an absolute evil that can be made any conventions with. I think it's going to be a different name for myself. I'm using this name, totalitarianism. It's not a clear term, but it's not strictly linked to a certain national regime, because in classical work of Hannah Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she was probably one of the first theorists of this concept. She spoke in her book about the Soviet Union and Germany, and she demonstrated the differences and similarities. And those similarities, they're very important. In other words, we can say that this is accumulation of evil. This totalitarian turn, when Russia turned into totalitarian state in 2022? No, I think that the real turn happened in 2000 when Putin returned the Soviet anthem. And when they put on the walls of Lubyanka the plaque of memory plaque of Yuri Andropov, who was a famous villain and who killed a lot of good Soviet people. So we are back to the issue of memory, to the issue of penance, the work that was done in Germany and the work that has never been done in Russia and the Soviet Union. So Yuri, thank you very much for this talk. We had Yuri Pivovarov in our studio, academician and historian. And back to the question we started with. In history, there is no determinism. There is certain objective facts, but there is always a freedom of choice. And Russia made a choice that it made in 2000 with Putin and in 2022, starting the war. Responsibility is not on history, it is on people. This is Archaeology Special Interview. Our guest was Yuri Pivovarov, historian and academician. My name is Sergei Medvedev. Be with us, Radio Liberty, Current Time channel.